The storm came down from the mountains just before dusk, swallowing the prairie in a curtain of white. Snow whipped across the frozen ground in sharp, stinging gusts, and the wind howled through the pines like a warning no one could ignore. Ethan Callahan pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and urged his horse forward. He had been searching for 2 missing cattle since early afternoon, and now the blizzard was closing in faster than he had expected. The ranch was still several miles away, hidden somewhere beyond the rolling hills and dark timberline. "Easy, boy," he muttered, patting the horse's neck. The animal snorted and lowered its head against the wind. Ethan had ridden through storms before. Years on the frontier had taught him how to read the sky, how to listen for the shift in the wind, and how to survive when nature turned cruel. But this storm felt different. It was heavier, wilder, as though the mountain itself had decided to bury the valley beneath snow. He was about to turn his horse toward home when he saw something strange ahead, a dark shape near the side of the trail. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree branch or a broken fence post. But as he rode closer, the shape became clearer. A wagon sat tilted in a ditch, one wheel snapped cleanly in half. Beside it lay scattered belongings, a blanket half buried in snow, a wooden trunk with its lid cracked open, and a small satchel frozen stiff against the ground. Ethan dismounted immediately. "Hello," he called, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. "Is anyone there?" No answer came. He moved around the wagon, his boots sinking deep into the snow. That was when he found her. A young woman lay curled against the side of the wagon, her thin cloak covered in ice. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid and clung to her pale face. One hand was pressed against her chest as though she had tried to keep herself warm. Ethan knelt beside her and touched her shoulder. She was cold, far too cold. "Miss," he said, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered weakly. For a moment, she looked at him with frightened, unfocused eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Don't leave me alone." The words struck him harder than the wind. Ethan glanced around quickly. There were no horses attached to the wagon, no sign of another traveler, and no fresh tracks besides his own. The storm had nearly erased everything. "Where are the others?" he asked gently. She tried to answer, but her voice failed. Her head dropped against the wagon wheel. Ethan looked inside the wagon and found a blanket covering a still figure. An older man lay there, his face pale and peaceful beneath the snow-dusted cloth. Ethan removed his hat. "I'm sorry," he murmured. The woman's father, he guessed. The poor man had likely died before the storm reached its worst. Whoever had been traveling with them had either fled or abandoned the wagon when the horses were lost. There was no time to think further. The woman would not survive another hour in the cold. Ethan stripped off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She shivered violently as he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but the effort was still difficult. Snow lashed his face, and the path back to the ranch was becoming harder to see. He secured her carefully in front of him on the horse, holding her close so she would not slip. "You're safe now," he said, though he was not entirely certain of it himself. The ride home was slow and dangerous. More than once, the horse stumbled in deep drifts. Ethan kept one arm around the woman while guiding the reins with the other. He could feel her trembling against him. "Stay awake if you can," he said over the roar of the wind. "What's your name?" "Clara," she whispered. "Clara," he repeated. "I'm Ethan Callahan. My ranch isn't far. We'll get you warm." She did not answer again. By the time the ranch house came into view, Ethan's beard was crusted with ice. The windows glowed faintly with firelight, a welcome sight against the darkness. Mrs. Granger, his elderly housekeeper, opened the door before he reached the porch. "Mercy, Ethan," she cried. "What have you found?" "A traveler," he said. "She's freezing. Prepare the warmest room." Mrs. Granger stepped aside at once. Ethan carried Clara through the doorway and into the house, where heat from the stone fireplace washed over them like a blessing. For a brief moment, Clara opened her eyes again. She looked at the fire, then at Ethan, and her expression softened with relief. "You brought me here," she whispered. "Yes," Ethan said quietly. Then she fell asleep in his arms, and Ethan carried her down the hallway into the warmest room in the house. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the ranch house, beside the fire, Clara Bennett was finally safe. Morning arrived quietly, though the storm had not yet surrendered. Thick snow blanketed the ranch, covering fences, corrals, and wagon tracks until the world beyond the windows looked untouched. Inside the Callahan ranch house, however, warmth filled every corner. Fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Clara Bennett slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The soft feather pillow beneath her head, the thick quilt covering her, and the polished wooden walls around her felt nothing like the rough wagon she had been traveling in. Then memories returned in scattered pieces: the broken wagon, the bitter wind, her father's lifeless body, and the tall stranger who had wrapped her in a heavy buffalo coat before carrying her through the blizzard. A gentle knock came at the door. An elderly woman stepped inside carrying a steaming bowl of broth. "Well," she said with a kind smile, "looks like our guest has finally awakened." Clara tried to sit up but immediately became dizzy. "Easy now," the woman said, setting the bowl on a nearby table. "You've been asleep nearly a full day." "A day?" Clara asked weakly. The woman nodded. "The fever worried us more than the cold, but you're strong. I'm Martha Granger. I've looked after this ranch, and Ethan, for almost 20 years. Clara lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry for bringing trouble into your home." Mrs. Granger chuckled softly. "The only trouble around here is that stubborn rancher who forgets to eat when he's working." Clara managed a faint smile. Where is Mr. Callahan?" "Out feeding the livestock. Snow doesn't stop cattle from getting hungry." As if summoned by his name, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A moment later Ethan appeared in the doorway, brushing snow from his coat. He removed his hat politely. "I see you're awake." Clara immediately tried to climb out of bed. "I've stayed far too long already. Thank you for saving me. I'll gather my things and leave." Ethan frowned. "You can barely stand. I can't burden you." "You aren't." She hesitated. "I can sleep in the barn until the road's clear." Mrs. Granger gasped. "The barn? It would only be temporary." Ethan folded his arms. "No." She looked up, surprised. "The barn is for horses," he said evenly. "You're staying here until you're well. I couldn't possibly take your room." "You already have." Clara blinked. "What?" "It's the warmest room in the house," Ethan explained. "The fireplace chimney runs behind that wall. You'll recover faster here." "I don't deserve such kindness." Ethan's expression softened. "Out here, surviving winter has nothing to do with deserving." Silence settled between them. Finally Clara whispered, "Thank you." Over the next several days, the storm finally passed, but snow remained piled high across the valley. Clara slowly regained her strength. She insisted on helping Mrs. Granger despite repeated protests. One morning Ethan entered the kitchen to find Clara kneading bread dough. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough. You nearly froze to death. And now I'm making breakfast." Mrs. Granger smiled from the stove. "I told her the same thing. She wouldn't listen." Clara laughed softly. "I've never liked sitting still." Ethan shook his head. "You're as stubborn as anyone I've met." "So I've been told." For the first time in years, Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. As Clara recovered, she quietly learned the rhythm of ranch life. She helped gather eggs from the chicken coop. She mended torn blankets for the ranch hands. She polished lanterns until they shone. One afternoon she noticed a loose hinge on the front gate and spent nearly an hour repairing it with simple tools she found in the shed. When Ethan returned from checking the fences, he stopped and stared. "You fixed that?" It was squeaking. "I've ignored it for 6 months. It was bothering me." He laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even himself. Mrs. Granger noticed immediately. "I haven't heard that sound in a long time," she whispered later. That evening, after supper, Clara sat quietly near the fireplace, sewing a tear in Ethan's buffalo coat. He looked up from the ledger he had been reading. "You don't have to do that." "I know. You've already thanked me enough." She carefully threaded another stitch. "This isn't repayment." "What is it?" She smiled without looking up. "It's gratitude." Ethan watched the flames dance across the hearth. Since losing his wife 3 winters earlier, the ranch house had become painfully quiet. Meals had been silent. Even the fire seemed to crackle more softly. Now laughter echoed through the kitchen. Fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. Someone hummed while sweeping the floors. The house no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, it felt alive. Ethan glanced toward Clara. She was completely focused on repairing his worn coat, unaware that he was watching. He quickly looked away before she noticed. Outside, snow still covered the land for miles. Inside, the warmest room in the house had begun warming something Ethan believed winter had frozen forever, his lonely heart. Nearly a month passed after the great blizzard, and winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. The snow still covered the hills in patches, but warmer afternoons had begun melting the thick drifts around the ranch. Water trickled beneath sheets of ice, and the first birds returned to the cottonwood trees, singing hopeful songs that had been absent all season. Life at the Callahan Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every morning, Ethan was awake before sunrise. By the time the eastern sky glowed with pale gold, he was already feeding horses, checking fences, or riding across the pastures. To his surprise, Clara was often awake before him. One chilly morning, Ethan stepped into the kitchen expecting to find only Mrs. Granger preparing breakfast. Instead, Clara stood at the stove, carefully flipping hotcakes while humming a cheerful tune. "You know," Ethan said, removing his gloves, "most guests sleep late." Clara smiled without turning around. "Then perhaps it's a good thing I stopped being a guest." Mrs. Granger laughed from the table. "I've been trying to tell Ethan that for weeks." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh. He still thinks you'll leave the moment the road's clear." Clara's smile faded slightly. "I don't wish to impose." "You aren't," Ethan answered more quickly than he intended. An awkward silence followed. Mrs. Granger wisely changed the subject. "The coffee's getting cold." As spring approached, work around the ranch became busier. One afternoon, a young calf became trapped in the muddy edge of a swollen creek. The frightened animal cried helplessly while several ranch hands argued about how to pull it free. Before anyone could decide, Clara waded into the icy water. "Miss Bennett," one of the cowboys shouted. Ignoring the freezing mud soaking her boots, Clara gently spoke to the frightened calf while slipping a rope beneath its body. "Easy now," she whispered. "You're all right." The calf gradually stopped struggling. Working together, Ethan and the ranch hands pulled the young animal safely onto dry ground. Everyone cheered. One cowboy shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen a calf calm down that fast." Clara scratched the little animal behind its ears. "It was scared." Ethan smiled. "So was I." She looked up. "You? I thought you'd fall into the creek." She laughed. "I'm tougher than I look. I've noticed." Not long afterward, Clara discovered an abandoned greenhouse behind the barn. Its windows were broken, and years of neglect had left the inside filled with weeds and broken flower pots. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked one afternoon after finding her sweeping dirt from the floor. "Cleaning. I can see that. I thought vegetables might grow earlier in here." He looked around. "This place hasn't been used since." His voice trailed away. Clara noticed the sudden sadness in his eyes. "Since when?" "My wife planted flowers here." Silence settled between them. "I couldn't bear to come back after she died." Clara gently placed the broom against the wall. "You don't have to tell me if it hurts." Ethan stared through the dusty glass. Her name was Sarah. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in years. "We'd been married 5 years." His voice became quieter. "One winter she caught pneumonia. The doctor couldn't reach us because of the snow." He swallowed hard. "I held her hand until morning." Clara didn't interrupt. "I've always wondered if I should have done something differently." "You loved her," Clara said softly. "I wasn't enough." "No." He looked at her in surprise. "You couldn't stop a storm." His eyes remained fixed on hers. "My father died during our journey west," Clara continued. "For weeks I blamed myself because I couldn't save him." She lowered her head. "I kept asking what more I could have done. And I finally realized grief always whispers that we failed the people we loved." Tears glistened in Ethan's eyes. "But love isn't measured by miracles." Neither spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt understood. Days later, Ethan found Clara quietly placing fresh seedlings inside the repaired greenhouse. Sunlight poured through the newly cleaned windows. Rows of tiny green shoots stretched across wooden shelves. "You fixed it," he said. "We fixed it," Clara corrected. He looked around the room. For years this greenhouse had been a painful reminder of loss. Now it smelled of fresh soil and growing life. "It looks different." Clara smiled. "It isn't different." "No. It was always capable of growing beautiful things." Ethan understood she wasn't only talking about the greenhouse. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Ethan and Clara sat together on the front porch. The ranch was peaceful. Cattle grazed quietly. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. "You've changed this place," Ethan admitted. Clara looked toward the fields. "I only planted seeds." "You've planted more than vegetables." She turned toward him. "For the first time since Sarah died." He paused, searching for words. "I don't wake up expecting another lonely day." Clara smiled gently. "And for the first time since my father died." She looked at the lights glowing warmly inside the ranch house. "I don't feel like I'm wandering without a home." Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither spoke of love. But as the last light of day faded across the valley, both understood that something far deeper than friendship had quietly begun to grow. Like the first green shoots of spring breaking through the frozen ground, two wounded hearts were healing together. One gentle day at a time, spring finally arrived at the Callahan Ranch, painting the valley with fresh green grass and fields of wildflowers. The river swelled with melted snow from the mountains, birds nested in the cottonwood trees, and the long, bitter winter became little more than a memory. For Ethan, however, peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence along the northern pasture, he noticed something unusual. Fresh horse tracks crossed his land. There were at least 4 riders, and they hadn't come from the nearby town. He crouched beside the prints, studying them carefully. "They're heading toward the house," he muttered. His instincts immediately warned him that something was wrong. He mounted his horse and rode hard for home. Back at the ranch, Clara was hanging freshly washed blankets on a clothesline while Mrs. Granger prepared lunch inside the house. The quiet afternoon was broken by the thunder of approaching horses. Clara looked toward the front gate. 4 rough-looking men rode into the yard without asking permission. Their dusty coats, unshaven faces, and worn revolvers told her they were not ordinary travelers. The man leading them wore a black hat pulled low over his eyes. "Afternoon, miss," he said with a crooked smile. "We're looking for someone." Clara's heart began to race. She recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had stopped her father's wagon weeks before. The man who had stolen their horses. The man whose laughter she still remembered from that terrible night. She stepped backward. "You." The outlaw smiled wider. "So you survived." Before Clara could answer, Ethan rode into the yard. He swung down from his horse and walked calmly toward the strangers. "You boys seem lost." The leader glanced at Ethan. "You the owner?" "I am. We're here for the girl." Ethan's expression remained calm. "For what reason?" "She owes us something." Clara stepped beside Ethan. "I owe you nothing." The outlaw laughed. "Your old man was carrying money. My father had no money." "Maybe." He shrugged. "But he carried a map." Ethan frowned. "What map?" The outlaw looked directly at Clara. "The one showing where he'd hidden his gold." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "There was never any gold." "Liar. My father was a schoolteacher." The outlaw's smile disappeared. "I don't care if he was the president." He rested one hand on his revolver. "You're coming with us." Without hesitation, Ethan stepped between Clara and the men. "No." The single word hung heavily in the air. The outlaw narrowed his eyes. "You planning to stop us?" Ethan's voice remained steady. "You'll leave this ranch. We outnumber you." "Maybe." He didn't move. "But you're still leaving." For several long seconds no one spoke. The wind gently stirred the trees. Even the horses seemed to sense the growing danger. Then the outlaw slowly reached for his pistol. Before he could draw it, the sound of several rifles clicking echoed across the yard. The ranch hands had quietly gathered. 6 cowboys stood near the barn, each holding a Winchester rifle. Old Ben, Ethan's foreman, called out calmly. "Morning, boys." Another ranch hand grinned. "Looks like you've wandered onto the wrong ranch." The outlaws suddenly realized they were badly outnumbered. The leader spat into the dirt. "This isn't over." "It is today," Ethan replied. Just then another sound echoed across the valley. Sheriff Cole Harper and 2 deputies rode through the front gate. One of Ethan's ranch hands had quietly slipped away earlier to fetch help after seeing the strange riders approach. The sheriff looked from Ethan to the armed strangers. "Seems I've arrived just in time." The outlaw cursed under his breath. Sheriff Harper pointed toward the men. "Drop your weapons." None of them moved. "I said." He cocked his shotgun. "Drop them." One by one, revolvers hit the ground. The deputies quickly tied the men's hands. As they were being led away, the outlaw glared at Clara. "You got lucky." She looked him straight in the eye. "No." She glanced toward Ethan. "I found good people." That evening, quiet returned to the ranch. The sun dipped behind the hills, covering the valley in soft golden light. Clara stood alone near the repaired greenhouse, trying to steady her trembling hands. She hadn't realized how frightened she had been until everything was over. A few moments later, Ethan walked over. "You all right?" She nodded, though tears filled her eyes. "I thought they were going to take me." "They won't." "You couldn't have known that." "I did." She looked at him. "How?" "Because they would have had to get through me first." Her voice became barely a whisper. "You would have risked your life. I already decided that the day I carried you through the storm." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" Ethan looked toward the mountains where they had first met. At first. He smiled faintly. Because no decent man leaves someone to die. He hesitated. And now? She asked softly. He met her gaze. Now because I can't imagine this ranch, or my life, without you in it. Neither of them spoke again. The answer had been simple, honest, and impossible to misunderstand. For the first time since arriving at the Callahan Ranch, Clara realized she was no longer simply a guest who had been rescued from a storm. She had become someone worth fighting for. And Ethan finally understood that protecting Clara had nothing to do with duty anymore. It had everything to do with love. The days following the outlaw's arrest were peaceful again. Spring settled comfortably over the valley, filling the pastures with bright green grass and wildflowers. The cattle grew stronger, the horses ran freely across the hills, and the greenhouse behind the ranch house overflowed with vegetables, herbs, and colorful blooms. To anyone passing by, the Callahan Ranch looked happier than it had in years. Yet inside the house, an invisible change had begun. Clara had started packing. She did it quietly, folding her dresses into the same worn leather suitcase she had brought west with her father. She wrapped the few keepsakes she still owned, a family Bible, her father's pocket watch, and a faded photograph of her parents, in a soft cloth before placing them carefully inside. She paused as she held the photograph. "I wish you could see this place, Father," she whispered. "You would have loved it." But as much as she loved the ranch, she believed she could not stay forever. Ethan had rescued her when she had nowhere else to go. He had given her warmth, safety, and kindness without asking for anything in return. She could never repay that debt by becoming a burden. Mrs. Granger found her sitting on the edge of the bed that afternoon. "You've been awfully quiet today." Clara forced a smile. "I'm leaving tomorrow." The elderly woman stared at her. "Does Ethan know?" Clara slowly shook her head. "No." "Why on earth not?" "Because he'll only tell me to stay out of kindness." Mrs. Granger sat beside her. "My dear." She gently took Clara's hand. "Have you truly not seen the way that man looks at you?" Clara lowered her eyes. "He still carries the memory of his wife. He always will." Mrs. Granger smiled softly. "But memories don't prevent a heart from loving again." Clara remained silent. "I don't want him to feel guilty." "You won't know what he feels unless you give him the chance to say it." Still, Clara had made up her mind. She would leave before sunrise. The next morning, Ethan returned from checking the eastern pasture. Something immediately felt wrong. The front porch was unusually quiet. No cheerful humming drifted from the kitchen. No fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. Even the greenhouse door stood open, as though someone had left in a hurry. He stepped inside. "Mrs. Granger." The elderly housekeeper looked up from the stove. "You just missed breakfast." "Where's Clara?" Mrs. Granger hesitated. Then she sighed. "She left an hour ago." The word struck Ethan harder than any winter wind. "What?" "She didn't want to trouble you." He hurried down the hallway. The guest room door stood open. The bed was neatly made. The dresser drawers were empty. The small vase of wildflowers Clara always kept on the windowsill was gone. The room was exactly as it had been before she arrived. Cold. Empty. Silent. For the first time, Ethan realized something. It had never been the warm fireplace that made this the warmest room in the house. It had been Clara. He closed his eyes. "What have I done?" Mrs. Granger appeared behind him. "You never told her." "I thought she knew. People who have spent their lives feeling unwanted rarely assume they're loved." Those words pierced his heart. Without another second of hesitation, Ethan grabbed his hat and rushed outside. Clara walked slowly along the dirt road leading toward the nearest town. Her suitcase felt heavier with every mile. Not because of its weight. Because every step carried her farther away from the only place that had felt like home since her father's death. She refused to look back. If she did, she feared she might never find the strength to leave. Behind her, the sound of galloping hooves echoed across the valley. She stopped. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. Ethan. He pulled his horse to a stop beside her and quickly climbed down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears filled Clara's eyes. "Because I couldn't stay forever." "Who said you had to leave?" "I was only your guest." "You stopped being my guest a long time ago." She looked away. "I didn't want you to keep me here because you felt sorry for me." Ethan stepped closer. "This has nothing to do with pity." "Then why?" He took a deep breath. "For years, I believed that losing Sarah meant the happiest part of my life was over." He paused. "Then one winter afternoon, I found a frightened young woman beside a broken wagon." A small smile touched Clara's lips. "You carried her home." "I carried her into the warmest room I had." He gently took her hands. "But I was wrong." She looked into his eyes. "The warmest room was never that bedroom." "It wasn't?" He smiled. "No. It became warm because you filled this house with laughter. You filled it with hope. You made mornings something I looked forward to." His voice trembled. "You reminded me that loving again doesn't mean loving Sarah less." Clara could no longer hold back her tears. "I've been afraid." "So have I. I didn't know if there was still a place in your heart." "There is." He gently squeezed her hands. "There always will be." Then he reached into his coat pocket. He wasn't carrying a ring. Instead, he held out a small brass key. Clara looked at it curiously. "The key to the front door?" Ethan nodded. "I've carried it alone for years." He placed it in her hand. "If you'll have me." His voice softened. "I don't want you to stay because I rescued you." He smiled through misty eyes. "I want you to stay because you've rescued me." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she threw her arms around him. "I thought I'd lost my home twice." Ethan held her tightly. "You'll never lose it again." The wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the valley as they stood together in the middle of the quiet country road. Hand in hand, they turned back toward the ranch. Not as a lonely rancher and a grateful guest, but as two hearts walking home together, ready to build a future where the warmest room in the house would always be filled with love. The sun was setting behind the western mountains as Ethan and Clara rode back toward the Callahan ranch together. The valley glowed with shades of gold and amber, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers across the open fields. It was the same road Clara had walked only an hour before, believing she was leaving her home forever. Now she was returning, not as a guest, but as the woman Ethan loved. Mrs. Granger was standing on the front porch when they arrived. The moment she saw Clara sitting behind Ethan on the horse, she folded her arms with a knowing smile. "I was beginning to wonder how long it would take you," she called. Ethan chuckled. "You knew I'd go after her?" "My boy," Mrs. Granger replied, "I've known you since you were younger than the fence posts. The only surprise is that you didn't ride after her sooner." Clara laughed through happy tears. As soon as they stepped onto the porch, Mrs. Granger embraced them both. "Now," she said with a grin, "come inside before supper gets cold. Happy hearts still need warm meals." The weeks that followed were filled with joyful preparations. The little church in the nearby town had not hosted a wedding in months, and when news spread that Ethan Callahan was getting married again, nearly everyone wanted to attend. Many remembered the quiet rancher who had buried his wife 3 years earlier. Few believed they would ever see him smile the way he smiled now. Old Ben, Ethan's foreman, slapped him on the back one afternoon. "You know," he said, "I figured you'd spend the rest of your days talking to cattle." Ethan laughed. I almost did. What changed? Ethan looked toward the greenhouse, where Clara was arranging fresh flowers. A snowstorm. Ben grinned. Best storm that ever hit this valley. On the morning of the wedding, sunlight poured through the church windows. Clara wore a simple ivory dress that Mrs. Granger had carefully sewn by hand. Around her neck hung her mother's small silver locket, and tucked inside her bouquet was her father's old pocket watch chain, a quiet reminder that the people she loved would always be part of her journey. Ethan waited nervously at the front of the church. When the doors opened and Clara walked down the aisle, the entire room fell silent. To Ethan, she looked even more beautiful than she had on the day he carried her through the blizzard. Only now, there was warmth in her cheeks, joy in her eyes, and hope in every step she took. The preacher smiled warmly. We are gathered today because two people discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive when least expected. Ethan and Clara exchanged vows filled not with grand promises of perfection, but with simple commitments. I will stand beside you in every season, Ethan said. In sunshine and in storms, Clara replied. I will make this house a home. And I will fill it with love. When they were declared husband and wife, the little church erupted in applause. Married life suited them both. Together they worked the ranch from sunrise until evening. Ethan taught Clara everything he knew about raising cattle and breaking horses, while Clara transformed the ranch house into a place of warmth and welcome. The old greenhouse flourished with vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The kitchen was rarely quiet, its tables always covered with fresh bread, pies, and hot coffee. Laughter became as common as birdsong. Even the ranch hands noticed the difference. This place feels alive, one cowboy remarked. It always had good bones, Mrs. Granger answered. It just needed two good hearts. One harsh winter evening, nearly a year after their wedding, another blizzard swept across the valley. A frantic knock sounded at the front door. Ethan opened it to find a frightened young family, a husband, wife, and little girl whose wagon had become stuck in the snow. Without hesitation, he invited them inside. Clara knelt beside the shivering child and wrapped her in a warm blanket. Come, she said gently. I know exactly where you'll be most comfortable. She led the family down the hallway and opened the same bedroom where Ethan had once carried her after rescuing her from the storm. The fire burned brightly in the fireplace. Fresh quilts covered the bed. The room felt warm, safe, and welcoming. The little girl smiled. It's the coziest room I've ever seen. Clara looked toward Ethan. Their eyes met. Neither needed to say a word. Both remembered the night that room had changed their lives forever. Years passed. The Callahan Ranch became known throughout the frontier as a place where no traveler was ever turned away. Lost cowboys, weary settlers, widows with children, and families caught in winter storms all found shelter beneath its roof. Many stayed only a night. Some stayed longer until they found their footing again. Every guest was treated with kindness, a hot meal, and a bed in the warmest room of the house. Neighbors often asked Ethan why he welcomed so many strangers. He always smiled before answering. Because once, someone gave me a second chance when I thought my life was over. Clara would gently squeeze his hand and add. And once, someone carried me through the worst storm of my life. As the years turned their hair silver and their steps slower, they often sat together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold. Children and grandchildren filled the yard with laughter, chasing one another between the apple trees Clara had planted long ago. One evening, their eldest grandson asked, Grandpa, is it true you carried Grandma through a blizzard? Ethan smiled and looked at Clara. I did. Were you very strong? Ethan chuckled. I was strong enough to carry her through the snow. Clara slipped her hand into his and smiled. But it was she who carried my heart home. The children giggled, not fully understanding. Ethan and Clara understood perfectly. They had learned that the greatest warmth did not come from roaring fireplaces or thick stone walls. It came from compassion freely given, hope shared in the darkest seasons, and love that chose to remain through every storm. And so, long after the fiercest blizzard had faded into memory, the warmest room in the Callahan home never grew cold, for it was forever filled with the love of two people whose lives had been changed by one act of kindness on a winter's day.